One of the presidents of a big country stood up and said, well, sir, if we don't pay and we're attacked by Russia, will you protect us? I said, you didn't pay? You're delinquent? He said, yes, let's say that happened. No, I would not protect you. In fact, I would encourage them to do whatever the hell they want. You got to pay.
I think the transatlantic alliance is probably at the most fragile it's been for a long time. But in the last few weeks, there have been a series of shocks. Vice President Vance's speech at the Munich Security Conference, which was outright hostile towards Europe. The treatment of President Zelensky in the Oval Office, which shocked huge numbers of people across Europe, and actually actions, ending the military support, although it has been reinstated now. All of that has made many people in Europe worry that the United States, far from being the greatest ally of Europe, is outright hostile. And that's a big shock.
American President Donald Trump considers a major withdrawal of American forces from NATO's eastern flank. The consequences could, of course, be far-reaching. The NATO alliance faces its greatest test in decades.
Lord Peach, thank you so much for joining us today. By way of introduction, you were the 32nd chairman of the Military Committee of NATO. But if you go back in your RAF career before you ended up there, you're the first commander of the UK Joint Forces Command, Vice Chief of the Defence Staff, Chief of the Defence Staff, before you took on that chair role. I do not know in history of another four-star. It's done four-star appointments, and such pithy ones as well, culminating in that role of chairman of military committee. So we're going to talk a bit about NATO today. I cannot think of a better person to have with us. A very warm welcome to you.
Thank you.
If we can start off with your role in NATO. I was doing a bit of research before this. NATO's motto is in animus inconsciendo liber, in other words, Latin for a mind unfettered in deliberation. That served NATO well when we were lined up against the former Soviet Union, a single foe, all allies looking together. But ever since the fall of the Soviet Union, it's felt NATO's expanded. What is its primary role? And events most recently seem to have exposed a lot more division. There's less unity, it feels, particularly like with countries like Hungary. Do you sense that NATO is losing its way? Do you think it's the right model for the future? And how do you think it will need to sort of evolve in this new world order?
No, it's a fair question, Sean. I think what is happening is a major adjustment. And when something changes in a military operation or in a military alliance, NATO is a military alliance under political control, then the answer is to adapt. And if we go all the way back to 1949, when NATO was formed, ever since 1949, it's adapted, initially with 12 members. And then it's also worth remembering for anyone watching this podcast that actually every single one of the 32 allies in NATO have made a sovereign choice by their parliament, supported by all the other parliaments, to join the alliance through the membership action plan. So NATO has expanded organically. It has not expanded through coercion. It has not expanded because anybody, one single ally told anybody to expand or join NATO. Therefore, I think the model holds. NATO has proven itself. Let's think, for example, of a crisis in 1956 over Suez, when NATO was quite young. And there were a lot of strains then between allies, really serious strains involving the different views of allies. But NATO stuck to its purpose as a military alliance to defend each other in time of need. And I think that the motto is really about unfettered, meaning don't interfere. And NATO is a military alliance under political control. It's not a political organization with a military appendage or a military arm, as others may be, the United Nations or the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, or even the European Union. It is, at its heart, at its rootstock, 75 years ago, a military alliance. So therefore, I'm not saying it doesn't need to adapt. It's always needed to adapt. And now more than ever, that is true.
The very cornerstone of that military alliance was America. I know every nation should have an equal vote and the like, but if you look at defense spending, America's outweighs the rest of NATO nations put together. And we've seen with events over the last few months, that can the NATO alliance rely on America as being that steadfast backdrop. But now I appreciate I don't want to get into tactical day-to-day commentary from some of the new administration in the US, but it does raise questions about the core foundations of the NATO, which has served us so well. But if you were to invent an organization today to meet the challenges of the world, would it look like NATO?
Well, I think there's a distinction without diving into semantics of language or military doctrine. There's a difference between an alliance, which is formal, which is a treaty, which a sovereign nation has signed, and a coalition. And the word is being used a lot at the moment. And a coalition is, of course, a smaller group of nations, in this case, who may or may not come together for a specific purpose at a specific time. NATO as an alliance, and we always spelt it inside the alliance with a capital A, has that formal treaty. And the other thing I'd say to people watching a podcast like this is actually, even all these years later, 75 years, nobody's still alive, the people who drafted that treaty, the Washington Treaty of 1949, they have managed to produce a short, easy to read document which has stood the test of time. And everyone quotes Article 5. Everyone worries about Article 5 and the commitment. But every time it's been tested, it has worked. And there are many other articles by which NATO can continue and does continue, and my view, will continue to offer that safety, security, and stability, I think, for about 1.4, 1.5 billion people. So that's important. And the important concept, if there is one, to leave you with, Sean, is that of collective security. We are stronger together.
Yeah, but if I can pick you on that one point, though, part of the value of an organization like NATO is its military credibility, and one is the political unity, the political will to use it. And you do wonder these days, when it was formed and the single foe of the Soviet Union, that galvanized efforts. Today, you have countries like Hungary who are probably closer politically aligned with Russia. And given that the NATO is an organization that relies on unity to have its strength, has that been undermined, particularly with some of the narrative coming out from America talking, again, I don't want to get into the specific language, but it does feel like America said, our focus is on China. Europe, you need to worry about Russia. That can be interpreted by a lot of our potential enemies as critical fissures in the very principles of NATO.
And that's why the Secretary General is busy. He's traveling all the time and reassuring allies and reassuring everyone through the media that NATO is alive and well. And of course, there are different views on different subjects. I recall vividly, as the chair of the military committee for 3 years, 1,000 days, there were many times when we didn't achieve consensus immediately. Then it's a question of persuasion and staying and listening carefully to other people's arguments and eventually winning the argument through logic. And so it's not always easy. I would be the first to say that. But as the Secretary General, I think, has been saying all week, actually, that NATO works and it continues to work. And I've got faith in it continuing to work, particularly because I have, during lockdown, and I was in Brussels, I used the excellent NATO archive to study all prior crises. And actually, it has hung together pretty well through a number of different buffeting caused by international affairs, international relations, and particularly by events. And it was the British Secretary General, as it happens, Lord Robertson, George Robertson, who invoked Article 5 after 9/11 to protect the United States.
Yeah. Can I just tap you as well, though, on this funding issue? Because, it's long been, I think it wasn't meant to be an ambition to reach 2% of GDP. It was designed to be a floor, an FLOOR, to the spending of the alliance, more to demonstrate that if you're going to enjoy the protection that NATO provides, that you should be prepared to pay for it. And rather than in absolute terms, as a percentage of GDP is a level of commitment. That when President Trump last came into office, that there were 2/3 of NATO failing to meet that. Even when he returns, a third are not meeting it. Again, I don't want to step into specific language he's using, but even as a British national, it feels wrong that we spend more than other nations, and yet we all enjoy the same benefits. Do you think that lack of unanimity around commitment financially is as important as many in the media portray it to be?
Well, of course, the media, I know from my time in Brussels and my time in London and time elsewhere, that the division is often portrayed. And I was constantly reassuring people when I was in Brussels of the real common purpose that I enjoyed with my fellow chairman of the EU Military Committee. And I do so in this context. It is not the first time in history that the US president has come to NATO to say, you all need to spend more. That has been a fairly common refrain. It's not unique to the United States. And of course, percentage of GDP is a measure. And as you said, Sean, it is not necessarily a ceiling. And so we're seeing actually as both the defense of our continent of Europe, the security of our continent of Europe requires rearmament, resilience in particular, in order to deliver that security through credible armed forces. And therefore, defense spending has to increase. Now, there's always been an argument about conditions applying or different rates of increasing in spending. And I sat through many of those discussions as the military member of the North Atlantic Council for 3 years. And we always encourage the allies to do their best. And that is what will be going on now. Whether there's a number of percentage points of GDP where NATO feels satisfied, I don't think is the argument. The argument is we can see the threat. The threat has revealed itself following President Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine. That remains. Therefore, we need to take that seriously. The other thing I want to say, and perhaps expand on if you'll permit me, is after 75 years, the longest go of a military alliance that I can think of in history, and I have looked for others, NATO is really good at organizing. And as we are now in a rearmament phase, there are other things NATO can do. It has the authority to bring innovation, to bring interoperability, to make sure we don't have 32 different types of weapon systems. And I think now more than ever, we need to pay attention to that, to provide the very credibility that makes a military alliance strong by creating interoperability between all the allies. And I don't think anybody disagrees with that. The question is how we do it.
No, but you're touching on a subject. I mean, very close, because you and I are, well, I'm, Cold War warriors. So, and there's not many people serving. I don't think there's anybody serving now that was of that era when we used to have tachyvals and maxivals and the like. It felt like a very different world when you are in a threat environment rather than wars of choice. We seem to be facing wars of national survival then. We've talked a lot over many years about NEC, remember network enabled capability. We've not really seemed to be able to make much progress on that. So my simulator, your simulator, another simulator, it's very difficult to actually network them up together. And yet that's always been an ambition. Do you think that there will be more focus now on military capability and the influence that NATO can bring on that, rather than jobs for national industries, which I think has ended up being creating some real friction within the NATO organization, stopping us from actually developing much more coherent military joint capability?
I think this needs to change now. We can't carry on with bespoke weapon systems and allowing NATO to then bear the burden of trying to knit them all together at platoon level on a battlefield in the 21st century. That doesn't work. Your point, which is a valid point, Sean, about wars of choice or conflicts of choice, we are now facing a threat which requires a collective security response. In my time in NATO, and I seek no credit, it was the credit all goes to the Allies, we developed for the first time in 67 years a NATO military strategy. It's a classified document. It always will be a classified document. And it is aimed to provide that handrail for SACEUR's plans, SACEUR as the NATO Supreme Allied Commander, Europe as the NATO Operational Commander, a family of plans to defend our continent. And that also means NATO allies have to be able to operate together, both in a digital way, a practical way. I think the Ukraine war has shown us, if we needed to be reminded, Sean, the importance of logistics, weapon stocks, the importance of having sufficient modern munitions, not just a showcase or a window where we perhaps got away with it with air policing, for example. The consumption of air defense weapons, I think, has been a real eye-opener for many. I would also add, with my own background and my time in NATO, I already started this. It's time to be clear that we need a better, bigger, more focus on electronic warfare. If you put all that together, trying to procure at 32 is pretty much going to be operations normal, and we'll still then be fractured and it will be difficult to operate together. Therefore, what we need is a structure, an institutional framework, which allows us to procure more quickly and in a standard way. And there are many ways of doing that, Sean. And I'm not going to specify how that will be achieved. That's up to the allies. But I do specify that it needs to happen now, because the threat is real and it is not going to stop being a threat. And I really mean that. I think it's been obvious for some time. I was the chair of the military committee during the transition from those expeditionary operations, I would call them, to collective security. We did a great big exercise in 2018 called Trident Juncture in Norway, which was a very important exercise, the biggest we'd done for decades, which showed us that we needed to do this long before the war in Ukraine started. Now, what more evidence do we need? One way of doing that, by the way, bit of detail for a podcast, is through the collective will of 32 national armaments directors, through the collective will of 32 chiefs of defense who meet regularly together in a way that I don't think is always understood, is a very strong message. So I think there's a strength in military get-togethers in a formal setting. There's also an important point that we both remember, and you made the point about the Cold War, about exercises. If anything, the Ukraine war has hammered that nail for us. We need realistic, real-world exercises that have a real-world deterrence effect.
I wonder whether the problem is almost slightly worse, though, that the words that defined our military capability when in that Cold War era, when I was serving, were having redundancy. We had to have resilience. We had to have stockpiles. Whereas at the end of the Cold War, suddenly wars of choice. It all was about efficiency. It was about just in time. And I do wonder whether just the core narrative of the services, if we're going to be in wars of national survival, having all of our military, for example, nationally, all of our joint strike fighters on a single base, having all of our air transport a single base, having no redundancy in our systems, that must be spread across NATO as well. Yeah, that's a philosophical difference that you can't. It's not just a question of stocking stuff up, but you've got to actually have the doctrine around you that recognizes this is going to be a lot more expensive to conduct. It's not about, it's almost a change of concept completely from the post-Cold War era.
Or it's returning back to some of the concepts we already knew.
Yeah.
So if I take that together as a collective rather than have a long narrative discussion, my first predecessor as the chair of the NATO Standing Committee, as it was known in 1949, was General of the Army, 5-star, Omar Bradley. And he said, I think very powerfully, professionals talk logistics and amateurs talk strategy. And so really what we're talking about here in this podcast is logistics. It's having sufficient forward-based equipment to provide credible deterrence. It's having host nation support, a really important lesson from many exercises that flows with permissions, with weapons permits, the convoys that carry the arms and ammunition across the continent. It's having dispersal amongst your air forces and maritime forces rather than concentrating in a port and an air base, as you already highlighted. Interestingly, several of the air forces of Northern Europe didn't stop dispersal after the Cold War. They didn't stop. We chose to do it for different reasons, as we were deployed on an expeditionary footing the other side of the world. Therefore, we could take that risk at home. But many of the prior conflicts, as you know best than me, Sean, they demonstrated if you leave all your eggs in one basket and it's bombed, all your eggs are broken. So I do think there's nothing terribly new in this, and it's about relearning and relearning from allies. One of the things that really was a major lesson for me personally, as a former chief of defense, as the military head of NATO, was no one ally has a monopoly of all the good ideas. And it's worth working with groups of allies within the alliance. In the UK's case, for example, it's the Joint Expeditionary Force. And we learn a lot from each other. That all builds this idea of shared capability to deliver the credibility we need as a military alliance.
The other arm of this, though, is, and it is logistics, but in a different form, is our heavy reliance on smart weapons these days. And of course, smart weapons, and if you would be horribly simplistic, you'd say the millions of people lost their lives in the Second World War. There must be a smarter way of conducting warfare, smart weapons, precision strike, far less collateral damage. But those weapons all cost a fortune, and therefore we've only been able to afford small numbers of them. Is there a profound lesson that's come from Russia that if you're fighting an adversary who doesn't care about losing soldiers, then it eventually comes down to an attritional war, unless you are prepared to invest huge sums of money in massive stockpiles of these precision weapons? Do you think there's an appetite in the West for that sort of investment? And are there lessons that fall from Russia's approach to this that might get us rethinking about our appetite for casualties in war?
I would say there's a lot of lessons from the Ukrainians. And the Ukrainians have shown us that they can create really effective weapon systems much more cheaply. And that, I think, is essential for the next generation to learn that lesson from our Ukrainian friends. I think we're probably both aware of the cost equation in defense has never really been fully explainable, that everything has to be so expensive. I personally believe, and this is a personal view, Sean, I'm happy to accept it's a personal view, that sometimes we make weapon systems that are so complicated to operate, they take weeks, if not months, to train on. And I think there's a real need now to use technology to make things more simple. There's a need now to challenge, and we could do this through NATO, through the National Armaments Directors Collective, to challenge the cost base. And again, I think that would find favour at the political level at the North Atlantic Council. And I think it's the right thing to do anyway. And our Ukrainian friends have shown us the way with new materials and new micro technologies and small technologies. We don't necessarily need to keep accepting the endless cost growth. And it's time to go back to that sort of basic phenomenon. I mean, I think it was very interesting as the war began to look at heavy artillery shells and how few there were. And there's one good example of how an artillery shell over the time of my service, 50 years, has matured in its accuracy, but not necessarily in its volume in the case of NATO. And so I think stockpiles, for me personally, and this is a personal view on this podcast, is a big deal. And we need to make that clear. I'd mentioned earlier on host nation support. Again, this is big stuff. One of the advantages of the alliance now at 32 is in the north of Europe now, we have a contiguous border with the Baltic Sea, across the Baltic Sea, across the middle and southeast Europe, all the way down to the Black Sea. And I recall as a low-grade officer in the 90s, writing military essays on forward defense, which effectively was code for forward deployment, forward equipment, regular exercising, forward operating bases. Nothing wrong with that. We need to accept that those old concepts are still valid.
What about as NATO has expanded, there is an argument you can only move at the pace of the slowest. And I was thinking, particularly on the security side, if technology is our asymmetric advantage on the battlefield, how do we ensure NATO is bristling with the very latest technology? You talked about electronic warfare earlier. We both hail from an era where, the Soviet Union developed something, we developed a counter, they developed a counter. There was a constantly review, and it was all at very sensitive levels. When you've got some countries in NATO that might be more politically aligned with our potential enemies, how on earth do you ensure that NATO's military credibility stays at the cutting edge when there is always a risk that some of that might seep out to our enemies' horizon?
Well, when a nation, I did touch on this at the beginning, when a nation agrees as a sovereign choice to join the NATO alliance, there's an element of security that comes with that to keep NATO's secrets and protect NATO through vetting and through a robust security process. And that's as important today as it's always been. And I well recall the elements of security in the Cold War exercises, and woe betide the airman, the soldier, the sailor, or the marine who betrayed NATO secrets or lost his cryptography or whatever it was in those days when I was flying Tornadoes and before that Canberras. And it's a serious point. It may not be exciting for those who adore technology, but with technology comes the need to protect. With technology comes the need to be secure as well as to think secure. And by thinking, I mean about security. It's very topical right now, but it's important. NATO classified systems. One of the things I think I really see the difference, and that's a privilege of having been the chair of the military committee, is NATO's secure communication systems work 24/7. And I have absolute confidence in that. And that's such a powerful organizing principle for command and control. And really what we're talking about here for the future of warfare and the future of our alliance, to keep 1.5 billion people safe and secure, is to organize ourselves properly through modern, digitized command and control with small headquarters that are connected.
Picking up on that point, which we sort of flirted with a bit earlier, clearly it sounds like you're an advocate that NATO will prevail this latest upset. But there do seem to be some pretty significant cracks appearing. What do you think will be the break point? What will be the point at which, because at the moment, the Americans, I think for an understandable reason, have lost patience with some of the European countries of NATO that haven't been paying their way. And that resonates. There feels to be more of a nationalistic approach to a lot of countries, not just America. That would tend to draw them away from NATO as well. Is there a point at which NATO, its very credibility, everyone still says it's operating, but its very credibility is the fact that should, for example, one of the Baltic states be attacked, that America would come to the rescue as part of the Article 5. If actually people don't believe that's the case anymore, is there a case for developing some, not shadow, but some alternative? What might that look like? And would it just be a coalition of the willing initially? And is that potentially what we're seeing with Macron, with Starmer, and with the German nation as well?
Well, that's we're sitting here on the 27th of March when there's the meeting in Paris is still going on, so I'm not going to speculate about that. I think that there are different ways of answering that question. Firstly, I think I've already indicated there are groupings within the alliance where like-minded allies can get together and indeed share similar capabilities and get benefits from that and actually deliver more capability for less money through having the similar platforms. And you know that very well, and air forces tend to think that way. So I think that's already working. The Joint Expeditionary Force is one example. There are others in Southeast Europe. There are others of framework nations, leading nations in different parts of Europe. There are also nations who do not have all the high-end capabilities, and they may find this period of rearmament a pause to reflect on that. And let's be honest, many of the years of expeditionary operations were effectively light infantry with air support. That's what they were. Light infantry and special forces with air support. Well, now we need artillery, we need armor. Armor, not necessarily in the same measuring tank fleets way. We need, I mean, I think it's true now. I don't particularly like the phrase drones, but it doesn't matter. The UAVs have come of age, and we need to make sure that they are fully integrated properly. Again, I think we've got lessons to learn from the Ukrainians. So I think it's going to be a lot of different choices. In the short term, we have the NATO summit coming up in The Hague. That'll be an important moment to reflect on what some of the things you've just asked me. And the NATO command structure remains in place. And if you accuse me of repeating myself, I am. The NATO command structure is really, really important, because under the command of Sako as our operational commander for the whole of the alliance, with its joint forces commands and its component commands, it actually demonstrates through organization, command and control to deliver deterrence day to day, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, at sea, under the sea, in the air. And of course, that is not to everybody's liking who doesn't like NATO. But that's the point of NATO, is to provide that credible deterrence.
I also touch on the role of the nuclear deterrent here, because once again, the whole phrase nuclear deterrence is as much about military capability as it is about intent. In other words, your enemy has enough doubt that you're prepared to use it, for therefore it to be credible. And it's particularly timely because obviously Ukraine was the third largest nuclear power in the world, and gave those up in the 1994 Budapest memo. So there is a key role for nuclear deterrence in here. But of course, NATO only has 3 countries that are nuclear powers. If America becomes a bit more, if there are questions about its commitment to Europe, then all of a sudden it puts a huge burden on the UK and France. And of course, as I understand at the moment, France, it has a national capability. It's not declared to NATO. As a result of which, where do we stand, do you think, with regard to the nuclear deterrent? Is that something that NATO needs to find a way of not spreading out, but more nations taking responsibility for it? Because if America looks a bit more wavering, at the moment, it's only the United Kingdom providing a nuclear umbrella for the rest of NATO.
I think I understand why you've put the question that way. NATO is a nuclear alliance and has been a nuclear alliance for many decades. Within NATO, there is the Nuclear Planning Group, which involves all those allies that choose to belong to it. Within the Nuclear Planning Group, those nuclear deterrence missions are discussed, and those missions embrace a number of nations, not just the United Kingdom, France, and the United States, and providing, therefore, that meaning, that detail to NATO as a nuclear alliance. That is exercised, that is a sensitive and secret process, and nonetheless, it's important, I think, now that we don't start talking about nuclear war, we don't start talking about nuclear operations. But my message on this podcast is we need to raise our nuclear IQ. We need to understand what it is we're talking about, what capabilities we have, how they are made credible, how that credibility is sustained, and what it looks like in the future. That very nuclear deterrence is essential to keep the credibility of the alliance as a whole alive. And I don't see anything at this stage to challenge that. There is speculation, there are articles, there are people, but there are a few people around who really understand. I would highlight Professor Laurie Friedman from the United Kingdom, and it's worth listening and reading what Professor Friedman is saying. And so I think the deterrent function of NATO is intact, and I think it's vital ground. I just think we should all learn a bit more about what we're saying.
Yeah, the reason I was going to push you a little bit about this is it feels like Putin has been challenging that deterrence with a lot of his narrative. He kept talking about, moving nuclear weapons into Belarus, threatening nuclear exercises, and it would not have been lost on him that a lot of Western leaders were sort of cowering a little bit from that threat. It will be I would argue that we've done enough in the West to try to stop Ukraine losing, but not done enough to help it win. And every step of the way, Russia, President Putin has tried very hard to threaten the West to stop it getting involved. You and I are, former military guys. If you were planning the mission of invading Ukraine, your big strategic failure would be if the West was to get involved, because you'd know that you were sunk. So he's been very effective, but by scaring the West, hasn't that undermined the whole credibility of our nuclear deterrence along the way?
No, I don't think so. I understand again why you're asking the question, but I don't think so. I think the credibility of the alliance is intact as a nuclear alliance. One of the interesting consequences of recent years is the abrogation of so many arms control treaties by Russia. Again, not much commentary on it, but the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty, the body of arms control, carefully negotiated arms control towards the end of the Cold War, has almost gone. And that's something I do think is important for war colleges, staff colleges, and think tanks to think about. But I am very convinced that this nuclear alliance of ours called NATO is intact.
I guess it's a same sort of question. My final question to you really is that I think NATO has been spectacularly successful. I think it was an ingenious solution to a post-World War II problem. It won the Cold War. It prevailed, and it for the peace dividend was largely exploited in the years since then. There's a lot of scholars out there now, though, saying that if NATO didn't exist today, what would be the organization that would be generated in order to combat the axis of evil? So I guess my final question to you is, how do you think NATO should evolve? Indeed, if you think it should do, in order to make it more relevant for the threats that are emerging today?
That's a fair question. Again, they're all fair questions. I mean, I think NATO needs to, I would say NATO is good at strategic communications, and I would say that with experience. And the Secretary General is the spokesperson for the North Atlantic Council and the Alliance. And that is hard work for him, and he does extremely well. Within the group of the Chiefs of Defence, they also have a role to play. NATO exercises have a role to play to not only reassure the 32 nations who've made the choice to join the alliance, but also to provide that credible platform of deterrence. That's really important to demonstrate NATO is not only showing resolve, but demonstrate NATO's activity through we're stronger together with a command and control system that works, that's agile, digital, and modern, and learn the lessons from Ukraine. Smaller headquarters, which can be moved. We go back to dispersal, forward defense, exercises that really make people think and work hard. And if necessary, can bring partners in appropriate ways. But it's really important that all that comes together. And one of the things I can say with absolute confidence from my experience, I watched and was often moved by just how collective capability would be generated together in training opportunities, particularly as forces were being grouped together under NATO command to deploy to Afghanistan. Even that demonstrated not only we are stronger together, but everybody's professional military competence improved together. And you also remember that from tactical leadership program, from the tactical evaluations and so on. And there's nothing wrong with that. And I think professional military competence is at the heart of the credibility, which is at the heart of deterrence. So we should continue to do that. And high tech will always promise, and people who sell high tech will always promise a silver bullet. in my experience, 50 years serving, there are very few silver bullets, Sean. I think you would agree. But what there are these breakthrough moments where technology does demonstrate advances and advantage, and we should grab them. And there again, I would add, finally, we need to learn from our Ukrainian friends and exercise as if we mean it.
Yeah, there's no doubt that we feel more a shift towards war as a national survival, and that felt like what the Cold War was like. And there does feel a sense of deja vu about all of this. Lord Beach, thank you so much for your time. We've known each other for many years, and it's a huge privilege to have access to your experience and intellect on this very topical moment of the day. Thank you so much for your time.
Can I just make a comment back on your closing comment? I know it's probably inappropriate, but I'd just like to say I think there is a point, without frightening people, to make clear that the threat is real. There is a point that we do need to take national resilience very seriously. And one of the ways of doing that is to strengthen our reserves. And it's a very serious message for all allies. We need to strengthen our reserves so we have echelons to call upon in time of need. But good to see you.
Very true. Very true.
Thank you.
Lord Peach, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.